Good morning. We are continuing chapter 13 in North and South by Elizabeth Gaskell. I think we stopped on page 120, and I would like to go to the last 6 lines on that page. She says, I think I was well when mother died, but I have never been rightly strong since some time about that time. I began to work in a carding room soon after, and the fluff got in my lungs and poisoned me. And here we get the actual reason for Bessie Higgins' illness. She goes into detail on page 121 when she says, they say it winds around the lungs and tightens them up. Anyway, there's many a one as works in a carding room that falls into a waste, coughing and spitting blood because they just poisoned by the fluff. And this is very graphic, it's very explicit in the description. And I think it has an effect on the reader. And this is what Gaskell was trying to achieve, because the coughing, the spitting of blood, and yet people are forced to carry on working because they need the income to provide for their families. And Mary, of course, in her ignorance says, but can't it be helped? And then she carries on to explain that people don't have a choice, because if they stop working because of the illness, they will go hungry and their families will starve. And then on page 121, the last 3 lines about Mary, said Bessie, I wanted to ask you to be a friend to her. She's 17, but she's the last on us, and I don't want her to go to the mill, and yet I don't know what she's fit for. And so what really disturbs us there is that not only are these working class, but these are such unskilled people that there is no real other option. Well, I suppose Bessie is thinking maybe her sister Mary could become possibly a maid, but even there she has no skill. She doesn't know how to do things, and we see that very clearly demonstrated in the fact that she doesn't know how to keep the house clean. And she's almost binding Margaret, or creating a sense of obligation that Margaret will look out for her sister. And I think Bessie is speaking from a good place here, because she doesn't want her sister to end up with the same fate. She doesn't want her to become ill. And I think it's fair to say that Bessie sounds much older. She is 19, the same age as Margaret, and the younger sister Mary is 17. There isn't much of a gap, but the way she speaks of a sister, there is really that motherly concern for her. And then on page 122, 11 lines from the bottom of the page, because now we are back with the Hales. From that day forwards, Mrs. Hale became more and more of a suffering illness. And so for us as readers, it's important to be aware that Mrs. Hale's illness becomes progressively worse. Okay, there is no respite from her illness. And at this point, of course, Margaret still does not know. In fact, the father doesn't know what is actually wrong. On page 123, from line 11, that little paragraph from 11 from the top of the page, indeed, Margaret, this is now, of course, Margaret speaking to her father, Mr. Hale, about the mom. Indeed, Margaret, you are growing fanciful. In other words, you are imagining things. God knows I should be the first to take alarm if your mother were really ill. We always saw when she had her headaches at Helston, even without her telling us. She looks quite pale and white when she is ill, and now she has a bright, healthy color in her cheeks, just as she used to have when I first knew her. And so here we see that the father, he is confusing the color in her cheeks with youth, with health, with good health. But that's not the case at all. She tends to be feverish quite a lot, and that is what brings the flush of color to her face. And then on page 124, on the concluding page of chapter 13, because it was quite a short chapter, and we have the last 3 lines of that chapter. But she heard him pacing about, raccooning, as she and Edith used to call it, long after her slow and languid undressing was finished, long after she began to listen as she lay in bed. And so we see that even though Mr. Hale speaks to his daughter and he comes across really not bothered, really not buying into the idea that the mother is quite seriously ill, at night when he's alone, he's walking up and down, he's pacing the length of his room, and that shows us his mental state, that the man on some subconscious level is aware that there is a real problem with the wife. And so that grade 12 concludes chapter 13, and now we move on to chapter 14 of our novel. Chapter 14 is entitled The Meeting, and the epigraph is referring to Margaret Hale, who has her first, and I suppose we should use inverted commas, meeting with her brother Frederick. Now, it's important to be aware that there is a huge age gap between Margaret and her brother, and that explains why she doesn't have any real memories of her brother. Secondly, Margaret was living away from home. She was living with her cousins. Remember the really upmarket family, when her brother had his own traumatic business going on. And that explains why she has no idea what has happened, what has transpired. And then when she does return back home to Helston, and even now in Milton, it's something that her parents never speak of. His name is never mentioned. And so Margaret has always been in the dark. But now in chapter 14, Margaret, we see, develops a much closer bond with her mother. And this opens the door for her to get an idea what happened. So the little poem or few lines below the epigraph reads, "I was used to sleep at night as sweetly as a child. Now if the wind blew rough, it made me start and think of my poor boy tossing about upon the roaring seas, and then I seemed to feel that it was hard to take him from me for such a little fault." Now there are a few interesting things that come out in these few lines. The first thing that this is, the speaker would most likely be Mrs. Hale. And so Mrs. Hale longs for her son. And we're going to see that the more ill she becomes, the greater her longing is for her son. And then in the 4th line it says, "And I think of my poor boy tossing about." And of course the poor boy is Frederick Hale, except he's not a poor boy. He's a grown man who is simply living out the consequences of his actions. And then the last 2 lines says, to feel that it was hard to take him from me for such a little fault. And we're going to see that this fault, which seems really small to the mother, is actually not a little fault. It is an offense which is punishable by hanging. But of course, as a mother, she tends to overlook those realities. So on page 125, in the first, I think, 4 lines, it says, "It was a comfort to Margaret about this time to find that her mother drew more tenderly and intimately towards her than she had ever done since the days of her childhood. She took her to her heart as a confidential friend." Now, this is probably the only positive outcome of the mother's illness for our protagonist. We will remember from chapters past that Dixon, the mother's personal maid, who has been with her since before she was married, was far closer to Mrs. Hale than what her own daughter was. And page 125 expounds on this and reminds us that Margaret has even been jealous of Dixon because she was the one who longed to have the close relationship with her mother. In fact, she is the one who felt almost an outcast, maybe that's too strong a word, who felt quite alienated by the evidence of her mother's close relationship with her maid. They would be the ones talking in hushed whispers. They would be the one who would stop talking when she came into the room. And then from the sixth line from the bottom of the page, "One evening, Mr. Hale being absent, her mother began to talk to her about her brother Frederick, the very subject on which Margaret had longed to ask questions, and almost the only one on which her timidity overcame a natural openness." And so here Margaret has been holding back, and without being bidden to do so, Mrs. Hale feels free to speak about her son. And the trigger for this is that we see on page 126 in the first paragraph that she had been dreaming about him. Now, obviously, it's been years since she has seen her son, and the illness, of course, is just, I suppose, worsening the situation. And then from line 16, the mother is now responding to Margaret, asking where is her brother, and she says, "I can't remember the name of the place, but he is not called Hale. You must remember that, Margaret. Notice the FD in every corner of the letter. He has taken the name of Dickinson." And so the fact that he uses an alias tells us how ruined his name is in England, that he cannot use his own surname of Hale, and that tells us that he is also in danger of being arrested. And then 9 lines from the bottom of the page, she says, "If it does not pain you to speak too much about, doesn't pain you too much to speak about it," she's asking for details. "Pain? No," replied Mrs. Hale, her cheeks flushing. "Yet it is pain to think that perhaps I may never see my darling boy again. Or else he did write, Margaret. They may say what they like, but I have his letters to show, and I'll believe him, though he is my son, sooner than any court-martial on earth." And that is quite important, I think, because the mother is biased towards her son. She refuses to believe or even acknowledge that he has broken the law. Now, we will later on come into a detailed explanation, but suffice to say right now that Frederick Hale was in the Navy, and he was an officer. And being an officer automatically means that there's this gap between the officers and the rest of the men, but we'll come more to that. And so from page 20, 126, 127, all the way to 128, there is the detailed explanation of what happened to Frederick. The bottom line is that Frederick chose to align himself with the common sailors rather than maintain his role as officer. And when the men started with this mutiny, he thought he was doing the right thing. But like any military service, being in the Navy operates on the premise of rules. And when you break the rule, you are guilty of an offense. And so Frederick's offense is so much more serious because he was an officer. And when we go to page 129, line 13, we are now faced with the reality not only of what Frederick has done, but how he is seen by everybody else. Because a man gave the mother the newspaper. In fact, it says from line 12, he gave me a wicked newspaper to read, calling our Frederick a traitor of the blackest dye, a base, ungrateful disgrace to his profession. Oh, I cannot tell you what bad words they did not use. I took the newspaper in my hand, and as soon as I read it, I tore it into little bits. I tore it. So the mother becomes very agitated when she reads any negative report about her son. And I suppose we could make an argument that it is a mother's prerogative to always believe the best of her son. But the bottom line is that if Frederick comes to England, he can be arrested because there is no statutes of limitations on his offense. Now, statute of limitations simply means that when you break the law, every crime has just to make it really simple, I will say every crime has a lifespan. And when that lifespan, as long as that lifespan is there, you can be punished. Now, let me give you an example. Murder has no statute of limitations, meaning that even if it's 5 or 10 or 15 or 25 years later, you can still be punished for your crime. Theft, for example, has a statute of limitations. It differs from country to country, meaning that after 5 years, let's say 10 years, they will no longer prosecute you, and you are quite safe from that. But in this case, Frederick's crime has no statute of limitations, and so there's always the danger of him being arrested, being court-martialed, and not even imprisoned, but death by hanging. And so now the mother has given her biased interpretation, based on Frederick's letters, on what had transpired. And then the lines 10 from the bottom of the page, I think, Margaret, she continued, after a pause, in a weak, trembling, exhausted voice, I am glad of it. I am prouder of Frederick standing up against injustice than if he had simply been a good officer. Now, you can draw your own conclusions from that. I think the mother is just too much biased by her son, and she refuses to see anything wrong in what he has done. And then when we go to page 130, again, chapter 14 is luckily quite a short chapter as well. The fifth line from the top, it is 6 or 7 years ago. Would they still prosecute him, mother? If he came and stood his trial, what would be the punishment? Surely he might bring evidence of his great provocation, given the chance to justify why he did what he did, and then the mothers would then explain that others who accompanied him were hanged, and so the same thing would happen to him. And then in the last paragraph, the mother explains his current location. Frederick was in South America for several years, but now he is in Spain. Okay, and so chapter 14 ends with Mrs. Hale being in quite a low place emotionally. She's longing for a son, but simultaneously it does help the fact that she can discuss this with her daughter, and somehow it brings Frederick closer to her. Now we are going into chapter 15, and this is a slightly longer chapter. It deals with quite a weighty matter. It is entitled Masters and Men. And the epigraph says, "Thought fights with thought, out springs a spark of truth from the collision of the sword and shield." So the masters, of course, are the factory owners, the bosses. The men are the employees, the workers. And when the epigraph speaks about thought fights with thought, it's simply telling us that the two groups of men, they have different ideas, different perceptions of what should happen within the workplace. And that is what causes the friction. And we're going to see from masters and men, we are going to start preparing for the eventual strike which will take place. And at all times we need to bear in mind that Elizabeth Gaskell is highlighting the plight of the worker in the North. She wants the reader, her average Victorian woman, I suppose, to know what is happening so that they could, I think maybe discuss this with their males in their families, and thereby making everyone conscious and perhaps eventually resulting in change. And I think that was a very unrealistic hope that she had there, because I don't think it would go further than just drawing people's attention to the plight of the worker, because we know that in Victorian times women, their role was very limited. It was very superficial. So in the first 3 lines of chapter 15, Margaret said her father the next day, "We must return Mrs. Thornton's call. Your mother is not very well, and I think she cannot walk so far, but you and I will go this afternoon." And here we again have that Victorian, that etiquette which demands that they return the social visit. And I don't think that she was too thrilled about having to go and visit Mrs. Thornton, because we already know what Mrs. Thornton is like. Okay, then the second last paragraph on page 131 says, "She put the truth thus plainly and strongly because her father had so completely shut his mind against the idea when she had last named her fears about her mother's condition. But now the case was changed. He answered in a despondent tone, 'Do you think she has any hidden complaint? Do you think she's really ill? Has Dixon said anything? Oh, Margaret, I am haunted by the fear that our coming to Milton has killed her. My poor Maria.'" And so the father already knows that it was his selfish decision to move the family to Milton, which results in the mother becoming ill. And that is something that he must face himself. It's between him and his conscience. And I think when he speaks to his daughter Margaret, it's almost as if he's seeking some kind of absolution. He wants the daughter to tell him, no, no, of course not, father, it's not your fault. But we know as readers that it is the father's fault. On page 132, the last two paragraphs I think we need to focus on, because they don't really know anything about where Mr. Thornton lives. And we will see that there is this expectation that because he is so wealthy, that he's going to live in a really large house, maybe even a mansion, and he will be living in some grand area. But that's not the case with Mr. Thornton at all. And I think it's important again to remember how hard he grew up and how hard he had to work to become the successful tradesman. And that probably explains why he still lives close to the mill. In fact, Mr. Thornton and his mother lives on the same premises, and I assume it's quite a large premises, because we have the mill and we have some outbuildings, and there is a large open expanse of land, and Mr. Thornton's house is on the same property. It's all behind the big gates, the big wall. So perhaps it's one of the economies he still practices, to live in a very small house. The economy, the idea of still saving money, which is, I think, a slight dig at Mr. Thornton, the idea that he still thinks like a poor man. I think it's a slight dig at his working class background. She accordingly inquired of a passer-by and was informed that Mr. Thornton lived close to the mill and had the factory lodge door pointed out to her. At the end of a long dead wall, they noticed. The lodge door was like a common garden door. So there's nothing elaborate. There's nothing to show that money has been spent on, well, from the outside at least, of Mr. Thornton's accommodation. And then page 133 all the way to 134, we have a description of the interior. And while, yes, there is evidence of, money have been spent, the bottom line is it's more functional by nature. And then, of course, Mrs. Thornton comes in and she is beautifully dressed, but at the same time it's quite functional and practical. And then when we get to page 135, in the second last paragraph on the page, I'll just start reading it, I think, and then we'll talk about it. I do not quite understand what you mean by a mind getting stiff and rigid, nor do I admire those whirligig characters that are full of this thing today to be utterly forgetful of it in their new interest tomorrow. Having many interests does not suit life of a molten manufacturer. It is, or ought to be, enough for him to have one great desire and to bring all the purposes of his life to bear on the fulfillment of that. And so Mrs. Thornton is speaking here about her son, and she's not pleased at all that he has Mr. Hale as a tutor. In fact, she's not pleased at all that he has a tutor. She doesn't see the need for a tutor, and she feels that he should maintain his focus, and his focus should only be on his business, on being a successful tradesman, on increasing his status in the community. So she has no time, she has no place, she has no understanding for the enrichment of education. She doesn't understand that her son is at this point where for him education is equivalent to self-actualization, if we look at in terms of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. In fact, the last two lines of page 135 says, to hold and maintain a high honorable place among the merchants of his country, the men of his town, such a place my son has earned for himself. And to her, this should be his only focus. And then the top of page 136, that first paragraph, she just vents, no, maybe not vents, she just allows her pride in her son to be quite visible when she expands on how far Mr. Thornton's reputation has spread and how different people look up to him. So when Margaret speaks about Mr. Thornton, and to some extent she agrees with the mother starts thawing a little bit towards Margaret. She no longer sees Margaret in quite the negative light that she did before. And that's, of course, a good thing. In fact, I think we can say that there's some kind of an amicable relationship that begins between the two women, and that's all on page 136. And then on 137, when Margaret says that, oh, she heard people speaking very well about Mr. Thornton, and she gives all the details. Then Mrs. Thornton wants to know who told her all these good things. And she says on page 137 on top, a mother is curious and greedy of commendation of her children, you know. And I think it's, to the mother, it's like a feather in her cap when someone she doesn't even know of speaks well of John. And of course, we rarely call him John. We tend to be quite, we also as readers hold on to that Victorian formality, and we keep referring to him as Mr. Thornton. So when we come to the third paragraph, why? Because I suppose they might have consciences that told them how surely they were making the old mother into an advocate for them in case they had any plans on the son's heart. And now, I think it's necessary for me to even carry on reading, because she smiles.